Welcome to the third meeting in 2025 of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee. I'd like to remind everyone to please switch off and put to silent your mobile phones and other electronic devices. The first item of business is a declaration of interests. In accordance with Section 3 of the Code of Conduct, I invite Katie Clark MSP to declare any interests relevant to the remit of the committee.
I have no relevant interest to declare.
Okay, thank you. And welcome, Katie, to the committee. And before we move on, I do want to take this opportunity on behalf of the committee to thank Daniel Johnson, MSP, for all his hard work and valuable contribution to the committee. Daniel certainly recognised the importance of the work of the committee and worked diligently as a committee member, and we wish him well for the future. The second item of business is to decide whether to take item 7 in private. Is the committee content to take this item in private?
Yes.
Moving to agenda item number 3. Today we are taking evidence on the committee's inquiry on framework legislation and Henry VIII powers. Can I welcome in the room today Finlay Carson MSP, the convener of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in the Scottish Parliament, and also Kenneth Gibson MSP, the convener of the Finance and Public Administration Committee here in the Scottish Parliament. And also online, Mike Hedges, the Chair of the Legislation, Justice and Constitution Committee, the Senate in Wales, and also Sir Jonathan Jones KC, the Senior Consultant at Linklaters LLP. I'd like to welcome you all to the committee this morning. So first of all, I'd like to, just to make you all aware, please don't worry about switching on the microphones because they'll be undertaken for you automatically. And if you'd like to come in on any question, please just raise your hand or indicate to the clerks. And also don't feel free to, if you don't want to answer all the questions, then that's not a problem at all. We do plan to have around about 1 hour for questions this morning. So with that, I'll just move straight on to the questions. So first of all, also the evidence that we've received has been certainly very helpful, and also the 2 evidence sessions that we have had thus far have been certainly very enlightening also. So just certainly to the panel, can you share some of your experiences in engaging with framework legislation and your reflections on what the main scrutiny challenges actually were? And I know certainly with the Finance Committee clearly highlighted the issue of the financial costs with regards to bills, and certainly I know that with regards to the Rural Committee, there was a couple of different definitions of framework that you also considered in your evidence. So go to Kenneth Gibson first.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning. What I would say is that there's been quite an element of frustration within the ranks of the Finance and Public Administration Committee with regard to some of the legislative proposals brought forward by the Scottish Government. We are of the view that stakeholder engagement and co-design is a really important part of the legislative process. But put quite simply, our view is that that process should take place before we get to primary legislation. And the reason for that is very straightforward. First of all, in terms of legislation itself, it's much easier to scrutinise legislation at the primary level rather than through subordinate legislation. When the government enacts legislation after a bill has been passed, obviously it makes it quite difficult for us to scrutinise. But even before we get to that stage, if we don't have a proper bill design whereby all the kind of proposals that the Scottish Government intend to implement through the bill are included, then we cannot ascertain what the ultimate costs will be for A, the Scottish Government, and B, for stakeholders. So that is, in our view, very inefficient, and it also poses risk to the Scottish budget because a bill could come through, costed at X million, and we find out that once secondary legislation is added to that, it's multiplied by several factors. So our view has been consistent across the legislative profile in this Parliament that framework bills, not something we're particularly keen on, but if they are going to be implemented, all the co-design work and stakeholder engagement should be prior to that bill coming to committee so that we can analyse the costs fully.
Thank you. Finlay Carson.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, echo much of what Kenny Gibbons has suggested. We've dealt with 4 framework bills. We've had the Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill, Good Food Nation, the Hunting with Dogs, and the Wildlife and Muirburn Bill. And they all could be described as framework bills, but all slightly different. So, for example, the Hunting with Dogs, the Wildlife and Muirburn Bill, much of the detail that wasn't on the face of the bill surrounds licensing schemes and guidance, which have been difficult, or there's not a place for the committee to scrutinise. Also, Kenny Gibson touched on bill design. We were quite concerned that it's quite difficult if all the policies, the important policies, are not on the face of the draft bill when it's first introduced to the committee. So we had examples where, with the Wildlife and Muirburn Bill, really important policies such as the barring of snares and also additional powers to SSPCA didn't appear in the draft bill when it was first introduced at stage 1. Also, with the Good Food Nation, there was no suggestion that we were going to have a food commissioner, which ultimately was part of the bill at the end of the process, which again is an important policy consideration. Along with that, it's probably appropriate to say that there is no requirement for the government to respond to a stage 1 report, and that is often in a framework bill when the committee can actually tease out some of the policy objectives that come with the bill. And it also assists with agreeing general principles. We found ourselves not quite sure what all the desired outcomes of a bill would be. And in one particular example, we didn't have a government response to our stage 1 report prior to the stage 1 debate, and ultimately the Parliament voting on the general principles. So these are areas, I think, concerned on the first questions that you've asked.
Okay. Thank you. Over to Mike Hedges, please.
The LGAC committee has become increasingly concerned about the use of framework legislation by the Welsh Government during the 6th Senedd. Framework legislation is being used more frequently in the Senedd compared to other UK legislatures, with framework bills accounting for 43% of all primary legislation introduced in the Senedd between May 2021 and March 2024. It's actually creating a shift in the balance of power from the Senedd to the Welsh Government. Because with framework bills, as you all know, it's very difficult to get the secondary legislation being scrutinised effectively. And we raised concerns about delegated powers being taken just in case, or to enable future proofing and flexibility. I mean, in general, there's serious concerns held by the committee that we're not seeing everything, and later on down the track, the detail starts coming out after the legislation has become legislation.
Okay, thank you. And Jonathan Jones.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me. I think my experience is obviously of the Westminster Parliament mainly. I thought it might be worth just saying a couple of words about why any of this matters and why I think it's right to be concerned about the increasing use of framework bills or the overuse of secondary powers. And I think there are really 3 points. First of all, that secondary legislation, whatever form it takes, is the law in just the same way that primary legislation is the law. So it matters just as much to ordinary citizens and to businesses. This is the law that they're required to obey. It can affect the way they carry on their lives and the way they do business, and it may carry criminal or regulatory or civil sanctions. So it's right to be concerned about the quality and the nature of secondary legislation for those reasons. Secondly, I think there's an issue about democratic legitimacy and scrutiny of secondary legislation. Other witnesses have touched on this. So do elected representatives have a proper opportunity to debate and scrutinise and influence the legislation which is being made? Do they even understand the laws which are being made in their name? And therefore, do elected representatives and ultimately their constituents have any real stake in the laws which are being made? So I think there is that point. And then the last point I'd make generally about this is around the quality of legislation. And that is that legislation which is properly debated and scrutinised is likely to be better legislation. You're more likely to avoid errors and unintended consequences and misunderstandings of what the law is intended to be. And that's obviously good for the citizen, good for society. If you have better laws, it also means you're less likely to have to bring forward correcting legislation. So those, I think, are why it matters. I think it is difficult to produce a clear-edged definition of what framework legislation is. I think there's a kind of continuum. It's not a binary issue that there's one category that's bad and another category that's okay. Many years ago, as a government lawyer, I worked on the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000, and that, I think, was one of the first really major uses of what I think we can regard as framework legislation, because it set the framework for financial services regulation, but with lots of the detail to be set out in secondary legislation. And whatever you think of the policy around financial services, it has worked. It has survived as a way of making really complicated law that does have to change from time to time without having to go back to Parliament every time there needs to be a relatively minor change and enact new primary legislation. But there are plenty of much worse examples, and I would highlight the retained EU law Revocation and Reform Act, which I think is at the other end of the spectrum, which gives very, very wide powers to ministers and devolved administrations to change the law in almost any way that they want, to change previous EU law. So if you take section 14 of that retained EU law act, you have a power on national authorities to make such alternative provision as they consider appropriate. And that's a very, very wide power. And I would say that's an example of the primary legislation not really setting any kind of policy direction at all. It's just a wide open power. It's more like a blank check in truth. So there I think are some examples from two ends of the spectrum and some reasons why I think any of this matters.
Thank you for that. I think, Finlay, you wanted to come back in?
Yep, I think it's important to put on record that the committee appreciates that things have changed. We're in a different world now than what we were in the past with technology and the speed of change. So, flexibility and adaptability of legislation is important. However, I think the overriding concern is around the scrutiny challenges and particularly the framework bill, in effect, legislates to delegate powers to Scottish ministers and others without the ability of the Parliament to understand what that is. So that gives concern over the cost that might arise due to the lack of detail in a bill. For example, the agriculture bill, where we're talking about a budget of £660 million, and there is absolutely a void in terms of lack of information around the purpose, about how the funding is going to be allocated, and ultimately the clear policy outcomes. And we also had issues with the hunting with dogs, with the licensing scheme, where ultimately some would believe that the licensing scheme has gone beyond what the spirit of the legislation actually intended, which once again, as we heard about in the previous witness, about secondary legislation is still the law. But ultimately we're allowing laws to be made at a level where the Parliament has little or no involvement.
Okay, thank you. And do you want to back in, Kenneth?
Yes, I think, Convener, one of the key issues is the fact that there's no clear definition of what a framework bill is, and it seems that every Cabinet Secretary or Minister has a different view on this, and indeed sometimes they don't even agree with their own bill team. So one example that I'll give you is that the Finance and Public Administration Committee looked at the police Ethics Bill, Financial Memorandum, for which we had some concerns, and we were advised by the bill team that it was a framework and enabling bill, but when the Cabinet Secretary came before us, she told us it was an amending bill. So there's a real issue there. We obviously tried to get clarification on this from a number of people within the Scottish Government, including the Minister for Parliamentary Business, presiding officer, etc., and the Permanent Secretary, who said, and I quote, on the 21st of May, that he was going to put something in writing around the definition so we can be clear what is and what is not in that bracket. So far, we haven't had that clarification. You probably know that the UK Government Cabinet Office Guide to Making Legislation calls it a framework legislation, I quote, a bill that leaves the substance or significant aspects of the policy to delegated legislation and might amount to series of powers providing for a wide range of things that could be done, with the detail on what will be done left to be set out in the regulations. So whether or not the Scottish Government and Parliament is going to look to see whether we can effectively have a framework, a definition of framework bill that aligns to that, or is something different, is yet to be seen.
Okay, I am conscious of time, but just on the definition point, the evidence that the committee has heard has been it's been unanimous in terms of how difficult it would be to actually obtain a definition. I think it was considered to be it was a spectrum as compared to something that was really quite fixed. And I think, as I touched upon in my opening comments to Finlay Carson, obviously with the submission that came in from the committee, I think that there are two definitions in that submission alone. So I think that does provide one of the challenges with regards to attempting to get to any type of definition of one sort or another.
What might be helpful is, if that is going to be the case and it's going to be a spectrum, we should at least know the parameters within a specific piece of legislation, so that makes the scrutiny function much easier for whichever committee is scrutinising.
Okay, thank you. Ross McCall.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. It's actually to yourself, Mr Gibson, I'd like to come back.
Sure, aye.
And it's sort of following on from that. Fantastic piece of work by the Committee on the Circular Economy Bill. And in that, you're quoted to have stated, we've seen an increase in use of framework bills that provide government with future enabling powers. These do not, however, provide best estimates of all likely costs and undermining parliamentary scrutiny. It also risks the Parliament passing legislation which may, in the end, once outcomes are fully understood, lead to significant cost increases, which I accept. And the bottom line, which I just want to highlight, is whether the outcomes it seeks to deliver outweigh any financial or affordable considerations. And it's the outcomes that I really want to question, because given the ambiguity of what a framework bill is or isn't, and the fact that sometimes we don't even know that at the inception of the bill, how important are the outcomes, and should the outcomes overweigh any financial situation in it? Should that be sacrosanct? Are we not putting enough evidence or strength onto outcomes in the first place? And is there an element to say that we just don't know what a framework bill actually is at the outset, and we should do more, especially from a financial position?
Well, yeah, in terms of outcomes, I think it's important that we do focus on outcomes, but they have to be funded, of course, and we must therefore have an element of realism within a financial memorandum. And if there's going to be a framework bill, we need to know that the outcomes that the Scottish Government seek to achieve will be fully funded. So in terms of that bill, committee took evidence which suggested from stakeholders that the actual delivery cost of that bill could be as much as twice what the Scottish Government was saying it was. Now, when you come to that level of differential, that clearly gives serious concern. And one of the issues, of course, where the committee took a lot of evidence on was, of course, on the National Care Service. And you'll be aware that the committee was not willing to accept the financial memorandum that was put forward by the Scottish Government. And the Scottish Government had to go back and completely rethink not only the financial memorandum itself and the costs inherent in that, but what its objectives were going to, and outcomes were going to be. So, for example, that bill went from 32 boards down to one. It went from transferring 75,000 council workers, to these boards, to not transferring them. So, if we get the finances, we have to get the finances right if we're going to deliver the outcomes that we actually want to see, and we can't get the finances right if we don't know what ultimately the bill is going to deliver, because it's not set out in the primary legislation.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. I think Mike Hedges wants to come in on a supplementary before I hand over to Jeremy Balfour.
Kenneth Gibson has just said, we'd had the additional learners' needs bill, where we ended up sending it back for a new financial estimate because it seemed to be substantially wrong. And it was only twice it, because there were areas where it was almost an order of magnitude higher. So I think it is important that we do know what things are going to cost when we agree them, rather than hoping at some stage in the future the money will be found.
Okay, thank you. And Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. I wonder if I can start my question with Jonathan Jones. On the presumption that we can have some understanding of what a framework bill is, do you think it would be helpful to then have guidelines or an agreement between the government and the Parliament on how these should be dealt with, and some kind of governing framework which would sit so that both parties then can work constructively together? Is that possible?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I had difficulty unmuting then. So I agree with that. I think it should be possible, and I think it would be a good idea to have some guidelines. And I was part of a working group on UK governance, which suggested such a thing for the Westminster and Whitehall administration. I said I don't think it's necessarily going to be possible to have a hard-edged definition of what a framework bill is. So you might take the definition that is in the UK Guide to Making Legislation, but that doesn't say that all framework bills are bad. It simply describes what one is. And I don't think it's necessarily the case that all bills with powers to update, for example, for changes in technology, are necessarily bad. There may be occasions when that kind of framework is justified. But I think the idea of having some guidelines by which you can judge whether such a bill is appropriate would be a good idea. And that might include, for example, it would certainly analyse the extent to which the overall policy is set out in the bill, rather than the completely open blank check that I referred to earlier on retained EU law. It might look at the scope of the powers, so how tightly defined are the powers in the bill, and it would look at what levels of scrutiny, what form of scrutiny applies to the exercise of those powers. And I think it might go further. For example, there might be an assumption that secondary legislation can't create criminal offences, or can only create criminal offences up to a certain level, or that secondary legislation, you can't use framework legislation to make significant interferences with fundamental rights, for example. That has to be done on the face of the primary legislation. So you could have at least presumptions, some guidelines, which would limit this completely open kind of blank check approach. And if for whatever reason a government, whether it's the Scottish Government or any of the other governments, thought it necessary to go beyond those guidelines, it would then have to explain why and justify why it had taken particular powers and why it had adopted a framework approach in a particular case. So I think all of that is worth doing. As I say, we recommended that for Westminster, and the Attorney General, Lord Hermer, has expressed some support from the idea that there needs to be some reining in on the use of framework bills and secondary legislation. I don't think the government here in London has so far has gone so far as to adopt that kind of guideline, but it looks as though they're thinking about it, and I think it is worth thinking about.
I wonder if I can go to Wales. Is that something that has been thought about within the Welsh situation? Is it something you're thinking of taking forward?
The labelling of a bill as framework by committee, which is what we do, can help raise awareness amongst legislators, interested stakeholders and the public, and could lead to an increased scrutiny of the regulations that are made using the powers in the Act. There's no government definition of a framework bill. We, as a committee, decide that we think something is a framework bill, and we challenge the government to tell us it's not. And as yet, they've not told us it's not. But there are substantial secondary legislation activities that take place. Some using Henry VIII's powers, which are happening quite often without any scrutiny at all.
Mr. Carson.
I'm not sure we should get too concerned about the definition of a framework bill. I think that sort of ignores the real issue, which is effective scrutiny of the government and effective scrutiny of the powers that are delegated to Scottish ministers. Whether it's defined as a framework bill or not, I think that's one of the issues we have here. Fundamentally, if we're going to see more framework bills, however you're defining that, the way that Parliament scrutinises legislation has got to keep pace. And at the moment, I'm not sure that that's the case. So back to the example of the stage 1, where we have policies coming in after stage 1, where we don't have a clear oversight of the objectives or clear policy outcomes, which the Finance Committee are concerned that the financial memorandum is almost impossible to create when we don't know what the policy outcomes are. Or, for example, the agricultural bill, we had 4 overriding but very wide objectives, but they were so wide-ranging that it's actually they were less than helpful. And then again, trying to cost those in the policies that might deliver those objectives is incredibly difficult. So I don't think we should get too tied up about defining what a framework bill is or what it's not, because ultimately we need to spend more time actually improving the way Parliament scrutinises legislation, no matter how it's defined.
I wonder, would it be helpful to have some kind of framework where, if there was a major change in policy between stage 1 and stage 2, that there would be an opportunity for the respective committees to then carry out some further scrutiny before stage 3? Is that something that could work in practice, or is that just going to make more work for your committees?
Certainly, when it came to the Good Food Nation, I vividly remember the conversation I had with the committee clerk about whether we should be scrutinising the bill at all at stage 1, because there was nothing to scrutinise. It was sole framework. It just set out delegating powers to Scottish ministers, and more time absolutely needed to be spent potentially at stage 2, or indeed a year on, when we're looking at the second legislation. So maybe we do, as a Parliament, need to spend less time on initial bill scrutiny and have a shorter and lighter process there, but then spend more time and have a more in-depth exercise when it actually comes to the secondary legislation. I think that's going to be how the Good Food Nation is ultimately going to pan out. And also the agriculture and rural communities, almost certainly the bulk of the policy delivery and the bulk of where the funding is going to allocate is going to be done a year on from when the Parliament passed the bill in the first place. So we maybe need to have a rejig of how Parliament keeps up to pace with ever more increasing incidents of these so-called framework bills.
Mr Gibson, with your experience of a number of different committees, is there a role for the committee to go back and do some kind of further evidence between stage 2 and stage 3?
I don't think that really is the point that we want to make as a finance committee. We want to see the scrutiny prior to stage 1. The committee's been very clear on that. We are keen on a definition of a framework bill. Now, it doesn't have to be in tablets of stone, but the problem is if it's too woolly, we might be comparing apples with oranges, and we might be in a situation whereby the government is view of a specific bill might be X and ours might be Y. So we don't want to be in that position. If we think about some of the numbers in these bills, we can be talking sometimes about hundreds of millions of pounds, and so we really do need to batten down the hatches a wee bit before we go to stage 1, certainly in terms of the financial memoranda.
Okay. I think you've both touched on this previously, but maybe if there's anything you want to expand. I mean, one of the justifications given by government is that they want to make this a much more consultation, taking stakeholders with them. And their argument is that that's easier to do once the framework bill or the bill has been passed. Are you sympathetic to that view, or do you think the consultation and development of policy with stakeholders should take place before the bill appears in Parliament?
Yeah, I agree. We've had, again, looking at the rural, the agriculture and rural communities, we had a vacuum of information around policy, and we did have some stakeholder engagement with the government, or if you like, co-design, but the outcomes of those discussions was not clear, and it wasn't really in the public domain, so there was still this void of information, and it was only selected organisations that actually played a role in that co-design. So there needs to be a wider consideration of all stakeholders and potentially some sort of legislative process to ensure that consultation and co-design is far-reaching and doesn't just focus on certain groups. We certainly saw that with the Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill.
Thank you. Mr Jones, I mean, just to come to you for a moment, from a UK Westminster perspective, we hear about co-design as well. Again, from your view, does that take place post or pre a framework bill being passed?
Well, I think as a general rule, you'd want to consult as early as possible. And if we take the view that the worst type of framework bill is one that doesn't really set any policy at all, it just includes a load of powers, and then the powers are exercised later to set out the policy, well, by then you might argue it's all too late because there's no proper opportunity to consult. There hasn't been a proper opportunity to consult or for legislators to comment on the bill, i.e. the primary legislation. Then the die is already cast. It becomes much more difficult then to influence the development of policy later. And that's my point about democratic legitimacy and also about the quality of the law. If legislation is introduced that hasn't been tested with stakeholders and experts and members of the public, it's more likely to be flawed and not to work properly. So I would say as a general rule, you would want to have tested the policy and consulted on it at the earliest stage, i.e. before the bill is introduced. It may then be necessary to have further consultation on the exercise of powers, and it may be that the primary legislation expressly provides that there must be consultation, imposes a legal duty to consult on later exercise of powers, and that may be a good model too.
Thank you, Convener.
And Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you all for the very wide-ranging answers, because I'm not left with an awful lot to ask that I was going to ask you. However, just a wee bit of taking us back a touch. In using the experiences that you've had, do you think changes could be made to the scrutiny of framework legislation, or maybe to enhance the scrutiny of particular elements in it, to bring about possible savings on the costs? I mean, because we should be looking to consider how much we're actually spending on legislation and the build-up to actually passing bills. So are there any ideas that you might have about how these costs could actually find savings within them?
The best way to ensure that we have the ability to make savings and ensure we're getting value for money is to have everything on the face of the bill, and with a financial memorandum that dots every I and crosses every T initially, because that way not just the Finance Public Administration Committee, but other people in the Parliament, other MSPs can come in and query some of those costs. So I think having that level of scrutiny at the start is really critical. Otherwise, we can disappear down a rabbit hole. If you end up with a bill which may already cost several £100 million, and then you add all the kind of bits and bobs to it as we go through secondary legislation, we could end up with some kind of hydra with something that wasn't initially envisaged. So, you know, you have stakeholders, for example, in co-design, you know, to a minimal degree before a bill, then a lot is added on afterwards. You end up with a bill that doesn't resemble what was proposed in the first place. I don't think that's appropriate. I don't think that's democratic. I think, you know, it's not only about scrutiny and efficiency and cost. It's about ensuring that the legislation that the government initially proposes is the legislation that actually delivers. So I think that's really important. In terms of secondary legislation, at the moment we more or less have a take it or leave it situation. You know, when we get secondary legislation brought to us, you know, because it can't really be amended, or can't be amended, we either vote for it or we don't. So I think that restricts the role of Parliament. The more opportunities Parliament has to scrutinise both the financial memorandum and the overall you know, objectives of the bill and the outcomes it hopes to deliver, then I think the better that is for everyone. And there's absolutely no reason at all why co-design can't happen and stakeholder involvement before we get to stage one. I think that's the most important. Would be the best way forward, frankly, and that's definitely the view of the Finance and Public Administration Committee.
Thank you. Finlay, do you want to?
Yep, I totally agree with what Kenneth suggests. You know, this requirement, legislative requirement for proper co-design, that to be set out prior to stage one, but also a requirement for the government to respond to the stage one report, because that's key to answering some of the questions about the direction of travel and policy terms that the government wish to follow and what the outcomes are going to be. So actually, government responding to stage one, I think it's absolutely critical to us understanding what the scope of the framework bill might be. As I said earlier, I think less time probably on scrutinising the primary legislation, but a clearer indication of when secondary legislation is going to come forward and how that's going to be delivered. We have plans that are made under legislation at the moment, but they're not necessarily subject to approval of the Parliament, and there is not a lot of consistency over that either. So I'll give you some examples. The Good Food Nation plan, the draft is to be laid for 60 days, and there's no requirement for approval. The Climate Change plan is to be laid for 120 days, no requirement for approval. The Islands plan, 40 days, no requirement for approval. And the Rural Support plan, which is absolutely critical and puts the meat in the bones of the Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill. There is no requirement for the draft to be laid in Parliament, despite it setting out how the ministers will actually deliver agricultural support, and ultimately the budget that's currently sitting at 660 million. And there's no requirement for the Parliament to approve that. So I think further investigation into how Parliament to have scrutiny at that level, given again it's putting the meat on the bones, and that I think that needs to have parliamentary oversight.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I know that Mike is looking as if he's got something happening down in Wales there as well in a similar nature. Please.
2 points I'd like to make. And I assume in Wales they have to respond to stage one reports. I've never known them not respond to stage one reports, either accepting or not accepting the recommendations. But they actually respond with their views on it. So I was surprised that doesn't happen in Scotland. The other thing is there's a way forward of using draft bills. So to identify the nature of a bill early, but governments don't like doing that. That for reasons of time and reasons of they've got it, they're ready to run with it. Though it may produce more effective legislation if we have draft bills, the Welsh Government also say they consult with a large number of stakeholders, and I have no reason to disbelieve them, but they obviously don't meet the requirements of the large number of stakeholders. Otherwise, stage one take evidence would be a lot shorter.
Well, that's very helpful as well from another perspective. Jonathan Jones, do you want to add anything at all?
Not a huge amount to add. I mean, I agree with the very powerful point that's been made, which is really that one of the reasons for objecting to framework legislation is the uncertainty about cost that parliamentarians are being asked to sign off. And that might be the kind of thing you would include in guidelines about when framework legislation is inappropriate. It's when it leaves questions of cost to be decided later under secondary legislation in a significant way. I agree with what's been said about the problems of scrutiny. Forgive me, obviously, as I keep saying, my experience is really in Westminster, but we have the same issue around most secondary legislation getting no meaningful scrutiny at all. And again, I and others have suggested ways in which scrutiny might be improved by having specialist subject matter committees look at the policy of secondary legislation. That hardly happens at all in Westminster. But one has to be realistic about limitations on parliamentary time. So it's all about being proportionate and, I guess, focusing in on the really significant exercises of secondary power and ensuring that they are properly scrutinised.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That's all very extremely helpful. Thank you, Convener.
Sure. With the pressures on parliamentary time, it may be an idea, and certainly something that my committee has considered, is whether there should be a statutory requirement for Scottish ministers to publish a report evaluating the impact of delegated powers and ultimately the impact of lead documents, which would clearly focus on areas that the committee thought there was a lack of scrutiny.
Okay, thank you, Finlay. Katie Clark.
Thank you very much. And the reason that I've heard given by ministers as to why they come forward with framework legislation is the resource and cost that goes into co-design. And what they argue is that if they don't know whether the Parliament is going to approve a piece of legislation, then it doesn't justify the significant cost and resource that would be required to create the detail, if you like. And I just wonder how you would respond to that, but also to some of the suggestions that have been made to this committee that there should be longer periods attached to the scrutiny for secondary legislation. There's been reference to a number of days. So, in situations where there is a bill passed that doesn't have all the detail, that it's actually set out in the bill, far greater detail and a more enhanced scrutiny process. I don't know if Finlay Carson would like to come in on that first.
Yes, certainly. I think we believe there should be a statutory requirement for stakeholder engagement and co-design at the earliest stage. I think the first point you touched on was that the government being frightened they do all this work and ultimately the Parliament rejects it. But I don't think the answer to that is produce a stage one draft bill which is so bland and so empty that Parliament is concerned about actually what powers we are then going to delegate to Scottish ministers in the future, which it wouldn't come under the type of scrutiny you get at stage one. So certainly when it comes to stakeholder engagement and co-design, I think it needs to be quite clear what the Parliament's expectations of the government would be. Because, as I said in an earlier response, some of that co-design or stakeholder engagement hasn't been as expansive as it might have been, and did seem to, focus on certain groups of stakeholders and not stakeholders in general, which has led to some issues around transparency and also the argument that, despite the efforts, there was still a vacuum of information around actually what the direction of travel the government were taking within the Framework Bill.
I don't know if Kenneth Gibson would want to respond.
Yes, good morning. Thanks very much. I think in actual fact the risks are much greater if you don't actually design in, everything before you go to stage one, frankly, because it could go in all sorts of directions and there can be all sorts of costs actually added to it. I mean, so we're concerned about cumulative risks or affordability. We're also concerned about the inefficiency of that and potential overspending. But what's important in any legislation is that you actually know that it's going to do what it says on the tin. And you can't have that if you're going to have a co-design post stage one. But I think what's important in terms of scrutiny as well is that, committees have to feel empowered to say no. So, for example, the Finance Committee, when we were presented with a financial memorandum in late 2022 in terms of the National Care Service Bill that we did not think was appropriate to that legislation, we simply sent it back for the government to think again, frankly, because it just wasn't acceptable to the committee. And I think that committees shouldn't kind of shrug their shoulders and bite their lip and say, well, it's not really what we're looking for, but we'll just nod it through. I think committees have to have the strength to say, I'm sorry, we don't really think this is doing what it should do. And remember, it doesn't help the government, to actually pass legislation that ultimately is going to come back in its face some years down the line. So it certainly doesn't help the people of Scotland that we represent. So I think what's important is we do as much of the work as we can at the earliest possible opportunity in the bill process, and I think that will lead to better outcomes ultimately.
Thank you. I don't know if Mike Hedges would want to come in on that, or Jonathan Jones.
Kenneth Gibson has just said.
If that's okay. So, I mean, one of the other issues, obviously, is the supporting documentation that comes with statutory instruments. And as you know, often as there's an explanatory note and often a policy note. In your experience, is the information that is provided accurate? Is it sufficient, particularly where delegated legislation is made from a framework bill? And this really is a question for the witnesses in the room. I don't know if Finlay Carson would like to come in first.
Yeah, certainly. I think the committee believes there is a need for more information and time for scrutiny of secondary legislation when powers are planned to be introduced. More time for parliamentary scrutiny. I think that's based on the fact that we have a current 40-day timescale, and that derives from legislation from the 1940s. So whether you could argue that it hasn't kept pace with the change in the primary legislation. So as primary legislation has changed, as we've discussed already, to reflect how we need to be more flexible, more adaptable, to reflect the social and technological advances and changes we see in society, there absolutely needs to be that change in the secondary legislation to reflect that, and I don't think that's there at the moment. You could argue that it's probably not fit for purpose. One of the big issues we have in the committee is information about, in advance, about how secondary legislation is going to be laid in terms of planning, the committee's ability to plan and prepare for that. So once again, the agricultural bill, we're going to have a significant amount of legislation, secondary legislation coming forward, probably in the autumn, but how that comes forward, we're not very clear. Another example may be instruments that were brought forward relating to deer management. I think there was 96 recommendations that may have required a number of instruments. But unless we see a package of instruments, it's very difficult for the committee to decide whether each individual instrument is proportionate and will actually deliver on the policy outcomes that the government wishes to see. So there is an issue around how the government plans to lay these packages as SSIs, if you like. Also, better support for parliamentary scrutiny. SSIs are the only item of the subject committee business which are not routinely reviewed by SPICE. We do get advice from SPICE on EU exit-related and UK SIs and legal support. However, we get more support for the UK subordinate legislation than we do effectively for the Scottish. So I believe that needs to be reviewed, given the additional volume of these we're likely to see.
That Kenny Gibson will be leaving. Kenny, is there anything you just want to put in the record?
Yes, I just want to respond there. I mean, one of the things that we express concerns about as a committee is the consistency of bill teams in terms of how they address financial memorandum. So, for example, it was clear when we were taking evidence of police ethics bill that the bill team didn't actually know what was expected of them in terms of the financial memorandum, and that's why we had to get the Cabinet Secretary in subsequently, and further to that, actually, we actually wrote to the Scottish Government urging them to put in place enhanced training and development for bill teams to improve the quality and consistency of presentation of future financial memoranda. And we basically said this should promote the importance of applying each of the steps in the Scottish Public Finance Manual. So we do need that consistency of approach. So one example I'll give, for example, just a random one, is that when figures are presented, some of them are rounded and some of them are precise. So again, you're not comparing like with like. So we think it's vitally important that whether it's one or the other, it's consistent throughout the way financial memoranda are presented to committee.
Thank you. Is there anything else you want to put in the record before you have to leave?
Nothing at this point. I just want to thank the committee for inviting us along this morning.
Okay, thank you. Is it a very brief one?
Very quick question, Mr Gibson, before you
Yeah,
depart.
of course, Chairman.
In regard to secondary legislation, I think, as you pointed out, you can't amend it. It's either accept it, reject it. And one of the thoughts put to us was, should there be some way that a committee could flag that up, maybe seek conversations with government about amending it, or in some way saying we agree with 80% of this instrument, but we have concerns around 20, and ask them to go away and think about it again. Would that work, or again is it something that sounds good in theory but in practice might not help?
To be honest, I could give you my own view on that, but I think in terms of the committee, I would have to actually speak to colleagues to see what they speak, seeing as I'm here actually representing the views of the committee rather than my own.
Okay, and just one there, Mr Carson, I don't know if you've got any views on that.
Yeah, I suppose we had an example where there was a recent SSI that came forward relating to a piece of legislation and the time that legislation would stay in place before being reviewed. And the only thing that was called into question was actually the date that would come to a conclusion, that the policy would end. But it would effectively have meant the government would have had to withdraw that SSI, or the committee or the Parliament would have had to have voted it down, which is not a good use of parliamentary time. And the issues around it could probably have been addressed and that the legislation passed rather than it being annulled and having to be reintroduced. So there is a case for the need to be able to have an effective way to amend secondary legislation, particularly given again the volume that we're likely to see.
Thank you. Good. Okay. Thank you, Mr Gibson. Back to Kitty Clark.
And if maybe I could put that point to Jonathan Jones from a Westminster perspective, do you think there is a case that we should be able to amend secondary legislation? Because at the moment we're put in a position where it's take it or leave it, and parliamentarians are not able to amend SSIs. Have you got a view on that, what the issues would be with that?
So I think a power to amend that has been suggested. I wouldn't rule it out, but I think it would be quite complicated to work out what the effective amendment would be. I think the idea of a kind of think again power is worth thinking about. So as a kind of middle course between, as you say, take it or leave it, and in practice in Westminster, SIs are virtually never rejected. So this is part of the problem, that they almost always completely get through. So as a middle course, you could have some route whereby, whether it's the House of Lords or the House of Commons, says we're not rejecting this, but we want you to think again about one particular issue. And then the government has to go away and think about the possible amendment rather than having backbenchers drafting amendments. And then they have to come back and then have to win a second vote. So I think that process might have to be adopted for the Scottish Parliament. I completely understand that. But some version of a middle route, which is short of rejection, but isn't acceptance, but involves highlighting a particular point on which the government is invited to think again. I think that is worth thinking about.
I don't know if Mike Hedges would have a view on that.
Mike Hedges and the committee have got a view on that. We're currently looking at whether the amendments of strategy instruments or motion to accompany them could be put down by members. I think that this is a personal view. I think that we're pushing on that, but I think the best we're going to get is the go and look at it again suggestion that Jonathan suggested. But I think that pushing them to, can we amend them? No. But can we ask you to look at them again? I think that's probably where we're going to end up.
Okay, thank you. And Ross McCall.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, hello again, everyone. My first question, if I could come to Mr Hedges first on this, because in your submission, I'm looking very much at what we call Henry VIII powers, so it's moving into that form. In the submission, you've made reference to a suggestion of strengthening the scrutiny on that. I think I'm going to read it out to you, I'm sure you remember, to require the ministers making them to consult with relevant stakeholders before making or laying a draft of a statutory instrument. So that kind of highlights to me that the possibility that there could be other forms of scrutiny. There should be a better way of scrutinising that sort of Henry VIII power. So what do you think might be a required or appropriate scrutiny for that form of legislation?
I think that the committee has strengthened the scrutiny of statutory instruments made by Henry VIII's powers, verifying them to be subject to consultation with relevant stakeholders. I mean, the committee is concerned. We dealt with a piece of legislation yesterday which had 20 Henry VIII's powers in it. And that's not abnormal. And we're moving to more and more Henry VIII's powers being brought in. Example, if I look at the piece of legislation, we looked at the agricultural bill. Within there, there were concerns that it contained a delegate power to amend the definition of agriculture. So it's an agricultural bill, but in there, there's an ability to amend what agriculture is. So I think that there are concerns. Governments like Henry VIII's powers, parliaments don't. And I think there needs to be some means by one rationing them. So they only come in with good reason. And what governments don't seem to like, or the Welsh government doesn't seem to like, is indexing anything. Instead of saying we're going to charge £100 a year for this, and then when Henry VIII powers go and change it in the future, rather than saying we're going to index it over the next 5 years against inflation or different prices, they just like to have that power, which does take out a lot of power from those of us who are scrutinising it. The committee is concerned about the great use of Henry VIII's powers, and also Henry VIII powers in UK bills in devolved areas. So these are things that are happening in UK bills, and Henry VIII powers for matters within devolved areas, particularly those could amend the Government of Wales Act, which could modify the Senate's legislative competence. We certainly have concerns right the way across Henry VIII's powers and their use.
So can I just come back on that? Because what we're trying to sort of maybe drill down to is what would be an effective form of scrutinising that. Are we talking about we just don't like them, let's not do it? Or is there, in your opinion, anything that we can do to try and find a sensible, suitable way of scrutinising and halting when need be?
Yeah, yes, I think that government and government civil servants like Henry VIII's powers, it makes life easier for them. I think that the first thing we need to do is have for every Henry VIII's power an explanation why that is the most appropriate way forward. And if it's being implemented, we need some future post-legislation investigations, scrutiny of how it's being used. This idea of just let us get on with it, and that Parliament really is a rubber stamp, I think it destroys the importance of Parliament.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Mr. Jones, based on what Mr. Hedges has just said, and that concern that we could have sort of Westminster encroaching on the devolved legislations, what's your opinion on that when it comes to Henry VIII powers?
Well, I agree with what Mr. Hedges has said about the concerns over excessive use of Henry VIII's powers. I think there's just a very particular extreme example of the problem we've been discussing of powers being taken which are then exercisable with no proper scrutiny, no proper democratic input. And obviously in that case, what you're talking about is the amendment of previous primary legislation. I don't think you can say, though, again, that all Henry VIII powers are bad. There will be times when it is more efficient just to update in a relatively minor way old law. So I think I'm with Mr. Hedges in terms of how do you then constrain the use of these powers. So you try and ensure that the powers are as narrow as possible, that it's very clear what type of legislation they are targeting and what types of amendments are to be permitted. And I agree about requiring governments to explain the reason why they've taken powers of that sort and being required to justify them. Then the question is, when those powers are exercised, how are they scrutinised? And as you know, there are different levels of scrutiny. So it might be that you require a debate, you might require additional supporting material to justify, to explain how the power is going to be exercised and why. I think one possibility we haven't really discussed so far, but which has been tried, as you know, is a kind of sifting process. So you have, which is tried particularly for the EU exit instruments, where you have a particular committee that is charged with looking at particular categories of instrument and deciding some may be anodyne and perfectly harmless and minor, but identifying the ones that aren't, that are really significant, and then requiring them to be looked at in more detail, whether by a particular specialist committee or by some further consultation or by debate. So that may be a process that you could apply. You could apply more generally, but you could certainly apply to Henry VIII powers.
Thank you very much. Mr. Carson, thank you. In your submission, you make reference to some bills, but not a lot when it comes to Henry VIII powers. Do you have anything that you wish to add, or is it?
Well, I could answer the question very simply. We've only had one Henry VIII power to consider in session 6, so we haven't taken a view on it generally. But just following on from Jonathan Jones's comments, I would absolutely agree that one of the things we did discuss was about the government setting out and explaining their approach on how they would identify how instruments should be treated by the Parliament, whether they should be the affirmative or the negative process, and how they came to that conclusion. And ideally that was done before the instruments were actually laid, to give the committee an opportunity to comment on the appropriateness of that approach. That was certainly something that we discussed, again, particularly given and in light of the Good Food Nation and the Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill, which will have significant numbers of instruments. So how the government approached these, with the committee felt it was important for us to understand why they were taking that approach. Because absolutely there will be some that need a very light touch and they're technical by nature and don't need much scrutiny. But others may be different, and the government's view on that and the committee or the Parliament's view on that might differ. And we would like to be able to explore why they differ.
That's excellent. Thank you. No more questions, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you. Just I've got one final question from myself. It's with regards to other parliaments. We've obviously reached out to contact others, and we actually have a meeting tomorrow morning with one of the state parliaments from Australia. But it's probably a question more for Jonathan Jones in the first instance, but I'm happy for other colleagues to come in if they get any comments to make. But are there any particular examples where you think that the Scottish Parliament and potentially other parliaments within the UK could look at to examine with regards to their use of framework legislation and also Henry VIII powers? Clearly they won't have Henry VIII except, but in terms of how they actually scrutinise, that could actually be a positive model to consider.
Well, I've mentioned the sifting process that was, I think, tried for the first time, at least in a major way, for the Brexit SIs. And whatever you think about that whole process, I think you did definitely need some kind of prioritisation and sifting process because of the volume of instruments that were being made and pushed through Parliament. And it is the case that many of them were very minor and technical and didn't merit detailed debate or use of parliamentary time. So I think that it may be worth looking at that model and how it worked and how successful it was in identifying the ones that were more significant and therefore did need more scrutiny and more debate. So that's the example I have in mind. There may be others. I'm afraid I can't pluck out examples, but I come back to this idea that not all SIs are bad, not even all Henry VIII powers are bad. So you need some kind of process for identifying the ones that are not necessarily bad, but need more scrutiny. And the sifting model may be worth looking at from that point of view.
Okay, thank you. Mike Hedges, do you want to come in? Anything you want to add?
Just to agree, I think the sifting model is necessary. And you're absolutely right. Not all items are barred. Not all Henry VIII's powers are barred. But the government does tend to say this is only a technical amendment, when sometimes there's a wide-ranging effect. So, yeah, I think the sifting process is necessary. I also think that an explanation of why this is only technical, but I think that sometimes you find what they call technical can have wide-ranging repercussions.
Okay, thank you. And Finlay Carson?
Yep, absolutely agree 100% with what we've just heard. It's sometimes very difficult. The Rural Affairs Committee did have a large volume of Brexit legislation, and you know, it's our job to make sure that nothing slips through. But ultimately, there's time pressures on the committee, and we often had the UK and the Scottish Government agreeing, but that didn't necessarily mean to say that these technical changes didn't have an impact that the Parliament needed to be aware of. So sifting and a sort of independent overview of whether they're technical or otherwise, just as Mike Hedges suggests, I think is important. But 100% agree, and we just repeat what the previous two witnesses have said.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Do colleagues have any final questions? No, thank you. Okay, thank you. And panellists, do you have any final points you'd like to put on the record? We'll start with Mike Hedges first.
I found it very informative, seeing what's happening with you, as much as perhaps providing some information to you on what's happening in Wales.
Thank you very much, Mr Hedges. Jonathan Jones?
No, nothing further from me. Thanks for asking me.
No problem, thank you. And Finlay Carson?
I think we just need to be aware that parliamentary procedures need to keep pace with the changing way that we see primary legislation come forward. Right now, I don't think it's an ideal situation, so I welcome this committee's oversight, and hopefully we can get a better approach.
Okay, no, thank you very much. So, with that, I'd like to thank all the panellists for their evidence today, and certainly if there are any further points that after today you feel would be very useful for the committee to be made aware of, can you please do so in writing, and that would be extremely helpful. So with that, once again, thank you very much, and I'll briefly suspend the meeting to allow the witnesses to leave the meeting. Thank you. Under agenda item number 4, we are considering instruments subject to the affirmative procedure. No points have been raised on the draft Disclosure Scotland Act 2020, List A and B offences, Amendment Regulations 2025, the draft Regulated Roles with Children and Adults Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025, and the draft Rehabilitation of Offenders Act 1974, Exclusions and Exceptions, Scotland, Amendment Number 2 Order 2025. Is the committee content with these instruments?
Yes.
Under agenda item number 5, we're considering instruments subject to the negative procedure. No points have been raised on SSIs 2025, 4 and 5. Is the committee content with these instruments?
Yes.
Under agenda item number 6, we're considering instruments not subject to any parliamentary control. No points have been raised on SSI 2024, 382 and SSI 2025-2. Is the committee content with these instruments?
Yes.
In relation to SSI 2024-382, does the committee wish to welcome that the Scottish Government has undertaken to reflect on the question of whether the statutory pay conditions should be narrated in the preamble of the order in the event that future orders are required under this enabling power?
Yes.
Thank you. And with that, I'll move the committee into private.